We've looked at a couple of different things over the past couple sessions. We looked at the rise of the modern mission movement, some very important early figures, particularly at Adoniram and Ann Judson, as well as William Carey and his team. We've looked at overall historical context, thinking through some of the events that are taking place on the world stage. As the world is kind of shifting into a more secular type of organizations, governments, all of those things taking place, the irony, of course, is that people are actually becoming more involved in mission work than when we see a lot of Christian types of governments. And so as the Holy Roman Empire begins to break up, as a lot of the Latin American countries start moving towards more secular types of organizations, as the United States continues to expand as a secular country, and in which there's the separation of church and state, more people are actually involved in missions and interested in missions than there had been before. So having thought through that, thought through the ways in which people are engaging in reform and in relief efforts out of the context of their commitment to Christian values, so thinking about the benevolent empire, thinking about the voluntary societies, etc. As these things are growing, missions is a very prime component in how Christians are thinking about the importance of being active in the world around them. When we think about missions in this time, in the 19th century, there are a couple of things to note. Not all mission efforts were the same. Essentially, there were 4 different types of mission efforts in the 19th century. 3 of them major efforts, the 4th kind of getting started in the 19th century, but will become more important in the 20th century. So one of those was denominational missions. Essentially, in these types of missions, there would be some sort of mission board within the structure of the denomination that would be responsible for selecting and sending missionaries, getting them trained, determining where to send them, and then providing them support. So a lot of the support for these types of missionary efforts came from within a particular denomination. So a Baptist board, or in the later 19th into the 20th century with the disciples of Christ will have a board of missions. So some missions were based off of the support of a specific denomination. Other types of missionary efforts were interdenominational. This is where a lot of the voluntary societies connected with the benevolent empire fell. Many of those were interdenominational, they were ecumenical, and so as these societies developed, they would draw supporters across the denominational boundaries, and so something like the American Bible Society, which we don't think of necessarily as a missionary endeavor, but it was, would have supporters across different denominations. So for these types of societies, missionaries would apply to the particular society for support, and then the board of the society would make a determination as to whether or not they wanted to support this individual. They would be the ones determining where individuals would go, but it is broader than a denomination making that decision. So, you might have a board that is mixed among different denominations, selecting missionaries from different denominations. We talked some about some of these societies when we were talking about Carey and others. So the society was responsible for the support and the sending of missionaries. A third type of missionary effort in the 19th century were faith missions. These tended to be interdenominational societies. Sometimes they could be denominational. But instead of the interdenominational societies, which gathered funds and did fundraising to pull together funds for financial support. The understanding in the faith missions was that missionaries were expected to raise their own support, or they were expected to kind of go the route of trusting that God would provide. So instead of being assured support through a specific organization or through a denomination, faith missions required the individual to actually try to raise their own support or just live a lifestyle of God's going to provide. The fourth type of missionary effort were the specialized missions. We see more specialized missions in the 20th century and the 21st century. Missionary efforts that were focused specifically around a specific type of endeavor. So, example of the American Bible Society here would be more of a specialized type of missions. Their goal was to provide people with the Bible. It wasn't so much, the focus of the American Bible Society wasn't so much on educating people or teaching them or indoctrinating them within a specific type of denomination or organization. Instead, the goal was to distribute copies of the Bible. The American Bible Society especially, the focus was producing Bibles that didn't have any notes or comments, just give people the text. You'll see this a lot more in the 20th century, 21st century, with medical missions or missionary efforts that are focused around media. They're producing a television show, or they're producing a radio show. Things that are focused around a specific set of endeavors or skills or focus. So specialized missions become something that develops in the 19th century, becomes much more prominent in the 20th century. These specialized missions, again, could be denominational or interdenominational, meaning it could be an organization within the denomination, or you could have groups that were pan-denominational. A lot of the effort, of course, in the 19th century was predominantly focused around these voluntary societies. The voluntary societies, of course, were efforts of the Benevolent Empire. Many of the organizations that developed within the Benevolent Empire had missions as a focus. So the Sunday School Union, or the American Bible and Tract Society, and even to some extent the American Bible Society. The focus was you spread this literature, you create these schools, you engage in this type of reform, and connected with that is the hope that people will be appealing or will be attracted to the message of Jesus, that they'll be interested in hearing the gospel, or as a supplement to what you're doing, there's the opportunity for preaching the gospel. And so, all of these organizations that develop that are connected with religious reform in the 19th century are very much focused on missionary endeavors and trying to, increase the number of people that are Christians while they are, also engaged in a variety of other reform efforts. Many of the voluntary societies involved groups of ministers as well as common Christians, lay Christians. There wasn't, it wasn't entirely lay-driven. It wasn't entirely clerically driven. Sometimes it was a mixture of both. A lot of them appear to be kind of lay initiatives. It was the common person in the pew that kind of says, we need to be involved in this, or we need to be doing this activity. And then they get ministerial support and ministers start joining the cause. In many cases, voluntary societies were interdenominational. They were not focused or sponsored by a specific denomination or a government, even though, the name of a denomination or the name of a nation might appear in the group's name. So the American Bible Society, the British Foreign Bible Society. Now, Additionally, since a lot of these were interdenominational and they were voluntary, the members of the group often had different theologies. These aren't new denominations that are starting. These aren't new churches that are starting. These are parachurch organizations that are meant to perform certain activities that are endeavoring to, achieve some sort of goal, but through cooperation of resources. So when you have these different groups, they're going to have, Presbyterian theology and Baptist theology is quite different on a lot of respects. There's some places where they overlap, but the theology of baptism is different, right? Baptists believe in believer's immersion. Presbyterians believe in infant sprinkling. So how can groups like this work together? Well, often in kind of the organizing documents, the statement of beliefs expressed by these voluntary societies, if they were truly interdenominational, tended to focus on very generic language. They tended to focus on what they called the essentials, or kind of just a lowest common denominator of what everyone who wanted to participate in this kind of effort would agree to. So the goal is not to create a society that only draws from one particular group of people, but would be open to a wide expanse of people and get a wide base of support across a variety of denominations. That, of course, would cause problems and would cause, some significant challenges in many respects. You think about, here you are as a board of missions, and if you are, truly pan-denominational, interdenominational, and you send missionaries out, and here you are on the board, let's say you're Presbyterian, and you're getting ready to send a Baptist out. How do you, even though everyone's agreed to this kind of statement of belief that says, these are the common things, there still has to be this concern of, well, I don't know that they're teaching exactly the right thing, because I believe they should be teaching this while they believe this. So it becomes a very kind of complicated situation, as any ecumenical endeavor does. How much are you willing to give up for cooperation? And how much freedom does a specific denomination or theological outlook have within that organization or within that context? One of the organizations that developed out of the Benevolent Empire, interested in foreign missions, not the only one, but one of them, was the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions. One that we had not really mentioned, but we did talk about. This was the group that would end up sending out the Judsons. It had started within the Congregationalist Church. Remember, the Congregationalists were the heirs of the Puritans. It was started by graduates of Williams College in Massachusetts. Many of them were also students at Andover Theological Seminary, which at the time was kind of the orthodox alternative to Harvard. If you remember, Adoniram Judson's father was one of the individuals involved in creating Andover. And so, Judson's very much connected here with this. So it started in 1810. There was a meeting of congregational ministers, and a man named Samuel Mills gets up to speak about missionary work in India as well as among Native Americans. And so, there's a discussion about this and what kind of efforts this group should be involved in. And one of the things that's decided is that, let's create a group that will look into what can we do in this particular area. What are some efforts that we can take? One of the early leaders was a man named Timothy Dwight, who we talked about in the Second Great Awakening, grandson of Jonathan Edwards. So the group consulted with another missionary society, the London Missionary Society. Remember, back towards the Judsons, this was, the Judsons were having problems getting support, so Adoniram goes to England to try and get support. The London Missionary Society was the one there. So the Board of Commissioners gets in contact with the London Missionary Society, gets some insight, how to structure, how to work, how to operate. And they particularly encourage them to work in India, which, of course, as we talked about with the Judsons, is a desire, but they end up working in Burma. The organization was officially chartered in June of 1812, and would go on from that. They decided that they would focus on 4 specific missionary fields. That they weren't just going to focus on India, but they would try to have a more global outlook, particularly in places that were not traditionally, that were currently in the 19th century considered to be Christian countries or Christian regions. The first of the missionary fields that they were interested in was the peoples of ancient civilizations, is how they put it. This would include peoples of India, Siam, which at the time was the 19th century name for Thailand, Malaya, which was near Thailand and Burma, as well as China. People that had, predominantly in East Asia, that had a deep history as cultures, and ones that there had not been sizable efforts, successful efforts done in missionary work from a Protestant perspective. The second missionary field was one they called the peoples of primitive cultures. This would include Native Americans, would also include West Africa, the Sandwich Islands, or what now is today is known as Hawaii, as well as Indonesia. The third missionary field were the peoples of the ancient Christian churches. These were places that were either had at one point been major sites of Christian activity, places like the Ottoman Empire, or were places where Catholicism had been very successful until recently. So places like Mexico and Spain, Italy and France, where there still was a sizable Catholic presence, but there had been, as we noted in some of the other videos, there had been some changes that had taken place with respect to the prevalence of Christianity. The fourth missionary field were peoples of the Islamic faith, and so there were efforts to send missionaries to Turkey, to Arabia, to Persia, to the Philippines, places where there was a sizable Muslim presence. Let's talk about some of the missionaries that were involved in this effort. There are a lot of places where people engaged in missionary activity in the 19th century. We're just going to focus on 2 of them. We're going to talk about Africa, and we're going to talk about China. But there was also efforts in the South Pacific. We talked about East Asia already. A wide variety of places that people are going in the 19th century engaged in mission work. Now, we've already looked at some of the efforts in India, in South Central Asia. Certainly not a complete overview. Even what we're going to do is not a complete overview, but to just kind of give you some ideas of what's taking place. Let's start with talking about Africa. Now, Africa had been a place where Christianity had spread very early on in the history of Christianity. And we've highlighted that before. That, the Nicene Council, for example, develops out of a controversy that takes place in northern Africa, and particularly in Alexandria, Egypt. Augustine, very important 4th century theologian, was bishop in North Africa. Tertullian was from North Africa. Clement of Alexandria. Origen. All people that were either from or operated in Africa, North Africa. But from the time of the fall of Rome, with the barbarian invasions, as well as with the rise of Islam, Africa had largely lost a sizable part of its Christian heritage. There were still some presence of Christians, for example, the Coptic Church in Egypt, and some other places. So Christianity wasn't completely obliterated in Egypt or in Africa, but it was certainly on a decline and certainly very much gone from Africa by the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. And so, you know, the Islamic presence, some of the troubles with Rome, etc. Now, when we think about Africa today in the 21st century, Africa has kind of completely turned around. There are churches in Africa that are sending missionaries to other places, including Europe, other places. There are probably even some missionary efforts in the United States from Africa. I'm not aware of them off the top of my head. But Africa, which for so many thousands of years was either Islamic or there was a presence of traditional African religions, you know, in the past 2 centuries has made a complete turnaround when it comes to Christian presence. Still a lot of Muslims in Africa. Still some presence of traditional African religions, but there is an extremely high prevalence of Christians in Africa. And as I've mentioned before in other classes, and even in this class, you know, the global south is where Christianity is increasing, and that would include Africa. So, in between these two periods, right, very early centuries today, this is where missionaries or where missionaries come into Africa to begin to mark this transition. Now, a lot of this is beginning somewhat with the slave trade, and so there's some missionary efforts there, but it's really the 19th century where you see more specific efforts to evangelize in Africa, where it's not always specifically about the slave trade. There's some Moravian presence in Africa in the 18th century, but it's really the 19th century that kicks this off, although the explosion is really the 20th century. The 19th century, a lot of the progress is very slow. A lot of the efforts are just kind of preliminary efforts, not bringing a lot of converts, etc. So the difficulties, of course, are the changes that have taken place in the history of Christianity, the presence of Islam, the lack of concern for Africa. But then there are other difficulties that marked the missionary efforts in Africa as well. One of those is death, particularly the death of missionaries. As Europeans spread to places outside of Europe, as colonists went to the Americas, to Australia, to other places, in many cases, these populations, the indigenous peoples of the Americas, the Aborigines in Africa and in Australia, those indigenous populations fell prey to the diseases that Europeans carried with them. Right? Smallpox, of course, is perhaps the biggest one. Well, the opposite was true in Africa, in that a lot of the European diseases, or a lot of the European peoples died from malaria, from yellow fever, from dysentery. And so as white people came to Africa, Africa was actually the more hostile environment to the Europeans. Another difficulty for missionaries had to do with the ties between the missionary enterprise and colonialism. The missionaries were often seen, and sometimes are still seen by peoples, as kind of the vanguard of colonization. And in some cases that's true. Not all cases, but in some cases that's true. And in the cases of African missions, missions to Africa were frequently criticized because of colonialism, especially kind of in a looking back kind of way. Well, it's true. I mean, some missionaries were very supportive of colonialism, and so some supportive of some atrocities connected with colonialism. You know, what it was doing to the indigenous peoples and the grasp for power and all these other kinds of things. Other missionaries were less supportive of colonialism. A lot of missionaries in the 19th century, though, believed that, you know, one key towards the development of peoples in Africa was that they adopt European customs, right? So it was very ethnocentric. The goal was to try to make Africans Europeans or make them Africans Americans. That too was an important component of Christianizing. That they would need to adopt American styles of dress, they would need to adopt European customs, whatever. Also connected and tied up with all these was that a lot of missionaries were racists. Now, sometimes that racism was actually less than other people. The merchants, traders, governmental officials, or sometimes more racist than missionaries. Additionally, the racism of some of the missionaries was more connected not so much with the color of the skin, although there were missionaries that were like that, as much as the assumption that the African races were degraded, were inferior because they had not had Christianity as an influence in their countries. So the racism wasn't any, sometimes, wasn't any sort of essentialist quality of particular color of a person's skin as much as it was the peoples are in this degraded state because Christianity hasn't been influencing them. That doesn't mean, I don't want to suggest that some of the attitudes that some of these missionaries had were any better simply because they had kind of this theological outlook, but it does say that they had a different view than a lot of other Europeans at the time. Many of the missionaries did. So it's a really complicated project here in thinking about, from a 21st century standpoint, any sort of evaluation of what was done. They saw the world through 19th century eyes. And the Europeans and the Americans that went to these various places saw the world differently than we do. That's not to excuse some things, but it is, to try and remind us that, we have to be careful how we approach understanding such people. So one of the key families involved in the early efforts at evangelizing Africa were the Moffats, Robert and Mary Moffat, often considered the pioneers of missions, particularly in South Africa, is where they are primarily involved, though they spread a couple other places as well. Robert was born in Scotland in 1795, had a very limited education, and that was one of the things that becomes difficult for him on the missionary field, especially working with other missionaries who had more education, often looked down at him. Robert's parents were Presbyterian. They were very interested in missions, tried to cultivate that in their son, but he, in his early years, wasn't that interested in mission work. It wasn't really something that he was particularly thinking of or was, really interested in, but eventually he becomes more active in his faith, more connected to, religious ideas and things, and it leads him to decide to become a missionary. So he applies to the London Missionary Society to become a missionary. At first they turn him down, later they will accept him. And he is to be sent to South Africa with other new missionaries. Now, his hope is to get married to a young lady he's very interested in, a woman named Mary. They would get married 3 years after Robert would go to South Africa. Mary's father was very supportive of Robert's desire to be a missionary. He thought that it was a great thing to do. He was not that interested in his daughters going with him. Right? He didn't want Mary to be on the mission field. So it was good enough for Robert. Hey, that's great, but not my daughter. Well, eventually that does change, and so the Moffats and Robert has been working for a couple of years in South Africa, and he will eventually get married to Mary. She will join. There was a lot of challenges the Moffats faced in Africa, ones that we've seen from in other situations as well. The English and Dutch colonists in South Africa were not supportive of efforts to Christianize the peoples of Africa, the indigenous peoples of Africa. Furthermore, the government prevented missionaries from kind of going further into what's known as the interior of South Africa. So they were limited for some extent as to where they could go, who they could talk to. There is not that much encouragement to be involved. So there's a lot of opposition that they face as well. Robert also is kind of disheartened in that a lot of the missionaries he is living with, working among, he thinks that they live some pretty immoral lives. And so, that's further demoralizing. Here you're supposed to be on this great effort to spread the gospel of Christ, and you look at some of the people you're working with, and they aren't living up to, the expectations you have. Eventually, though, some of those things will begin to change. He will have the opportunity to go into the interior. He'll begin making some colonists, some converts, not some colonists. And so, he does begin to have some limited success. Predominantly, one of the things that will kind of sway the colonists' support of Moffat is that he tries to convince these European colonists that conversion would be better for the indigenous population, and as it's better for the indigenous population, it would be better for the European population. And so as he makes some of these converts in the interior, he brings them back to some of these coastal areas, Cape Town, some of these other European centers, to try and show how wonderful and great these converts are. And that's kind of what does sway support to Moffat. He will go on to, the Moffats would go on to create a mission station that becomes pretty successful there in South Africa. Ultimately, they try to live pretty simply, while also engaging in evangelism. The Moffats, though, not only did they face challenges with the colonists, as they go out into the interior, create this mission station, start living among different African tribes, they face opposition from the people that they're living among. On the one hand, there's not a lot of people that are very receptive to the gospel, so this lack of interest. When a variety of natural disasters come, like droughts, there's a couple of droughts that occur. The Moffats are blamed for that. The missionaries are blamed for that. Some people would break into the compound, the mission station, steal supplies. So there's all sorts of things that they're facing. One thing, though, that begins to change that is another tribe comes through. So this kind of nomadic travelers. They don't really have a specific region they live in, and so violence erupts between the people that the Moffats are living among and these travelers. Well, Robert kind of is called upon to act as a negotiator, and where originally it looked like the tribe they were living among was going to get wiped out, he manages to kind of save them to some extent, and, to kind of keep them from disappearing and kind of keep their existence. Well, that does lead to a swing in how that particular tribe looks at Robert, and become much more respectful toward him. However, it doesn't really lead to more success in converting people. So he has difficulties with the colonists. He has difficulties with the tribes he's working among. And there's even difficulties just in the process of evangelism itself. Robert is unlike some of the other missionaries we've looked at before. Many of the other missionaries that we've emphasized, especially within Protestantism, have tried to situate themselves in their communities to understand how they think, their important concepts, their religion, their language. Robert doesn't do that. He doesn't really understand their conceptions, and so to try and make connections between Christianity and tribal religion, there's some difficulties there. He doesn't really try to learn the language at first, anyway. Later he will decide that he needs to learn the language. He really starts off trying to use a trade language, a trade Dutch language, that had been kind of invented for the Dutch colonists to trade with some of the Africans in South Africa. So he tries to use that, but it's this invented language, and it's, there's limited use there, there's limited vocabulary, so there's not as much ability for the language itself to be useful in trying to convert people. So that's a challenge. Well, he finally comes to the conclusion he's going to have to learn the language. So he spends time learning the language. He decides to translate the Bible, as we've seen other missionaries do. It takes him 29 years to finish translating the Bible. And evidently it was not a very good translation, but, it was something. But when he tries to print the translation, he has to actually learn how to do printmaking as well, because the European printers in South Africa wouldn't print something that was in the indigenous languages. They would only print Dutch or English. So not only does he have to work at learning a language and learning translation, but he has to go and actually learn the skills to put this into, or to make copies of this. The first baptisms started taking place about 10 years after he had arrived, and it begins to start to increase after that. People from other places would come to hear his message. After almost 50 years of service, Robert will return to England. And when he does, his son will continue the work. Mary, however, would die shortly after the return to England, and Robert would spend a good portion of the later part of his life traveling throughout Britain, encouraging people to become missionaries, to support missionaries, etc. Another better-known missionary who was very influential in African missions was David Livingstone. Livingstone actually becomes the son-in-law of the Moffats. And the irony is that Robert and Mary Moffat are actually more active missionaries than Livingstone. Livingstone is more of an explorer who did missionary work. But a lot of people in England knew so much more about Livingstone, and Livingstone is probably a name that is remembered historically for things other than missionary work. But so he's actually more influential in missionary work, even though he doesn't do a lot of missionary work. Livingstone was born in Scotland, wasn't necessarily very well off, and his family goes to work at the age of 10. working in a textile mill, but was interested in getting education, and so he does a lot of work in the evenings, goes to evening classes, etc., to try and better himself educationally. After his conversion, he becomes interested in being a missionary. Specifically, he wants to be a missionary doctor. Some of that is delayed, though. The family has some financial hardships, and so he has to wait a while before he's actually able to get his education in medicine. He becomes a missionary in 1840, has some background in medicine and theology at the time. It's not like a ton of efforts in missions, but there's some background here that will be helpful. He applies to the London Missionary Society to become a missionary. He's particularly interested in going to China, but there were problems at the time, political problems, military problems between Britain and China, the setup for what becomes known as the Opium War, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. So, decision made, okay, maybe China's not the best place for you to go right now. The Missionary Society's success, what about the West Indies? Livingston, though, by this point has been influenced by Moffat to some extent and says, no, I want to go to Africa. So he decides to go to Africa. He begins studying the language that used in South Africa while he is traveling to the Moffats. Well, when Livingston gets there, and even on the trip there, it becomes obvious that he's got some personality challenges that is going to make missionary work, cooperative missionary work, a challenge. He's very critical of a lot of the work that's being done in South Africa, of the other missionaries, some of which we might say, well, that's pretty valid. So, for example, he gets to South Africa and sees that the communities that are being set up aren't encouraging native leadership. That a lot of the leadership in communities and churches is Europeans. And so he's very critical of that. That's probably something that we would say, okay, yeah, that's probably a good criticism. But he's critical of other things as well. He would begin riding off toward northern regions to explore. He's very interested in exploring. Missionary efforts are kind of secondary to his interest in just kind of exploring Africa. Additionally, he is becoming a leader, and he gets married to the Moffat's oldest daughter. So, there's some things like this where he's becoming more prominent in some roles, but people don't particularly like some of the choices that he's making. They're chafing at his leadership. He's really kind of critical, so that becomes problematic as well. The Livingstons, once David marries the daughter of the Moffats, they would move a couple different times over the next couple of years. He's really interested in these expeditions, and so he'll move to these various places. Sometimes he would take his family on these expeditions, sometimes he wouldn't. Eventually this becomes, his family grows to pretty good size. They have several children. His in-laws, the Moffats, who are missionaries, are very concerned about these expeditions he's going on. They're missionaries. They're in Africa, but what Livingston is doing, they're concerned about the impact it's having on their daughter, physically, emotionally, the impact that it's having on their grandchildren. He would eventually send his family to England, for some health reasons and some other reasons. They will actually have a worse time of it in England with financial difficulties, but it's kind of like that frees him up. He's like, okay, now I can do more exploring. So he's just exploring Africa. They're struggling financially, emotionally, physically in Africa while he's going and doing all this.
the focus, of course, is exploring, but he's doing some evangelism. He would take essentially what we would call a slide projector today. It's not quite a slide projector, nor early form of that. And he would kind of show these scenes, biblical scenes, through this slide projector as a means to talk and evangelize. So he's doing some evangelism. But again, the bigger thing is this, his interest in just kind of exploring, going on these expeditions. He returned to England in the 1850s, and kind of, you'd think, okay, great time for reunion and family. No, he goes on a speaking tour, writes a book called Missionary Travels and Researches in South Africa, which will lead to new missionary societies being formed. So he is successful in encouraging people to be mission-minded. New missionary societies are formed. More people decide to go into missions. At this time, though, Livingstone will actually leave the London Missionary Society. He decides to go work for the British government rather than to stay with the Missionary Society. He will go back to Africa. Other missionaries follow him. Again, some of the same kind of conflicts, a lot of them related to Livingstone's his personality, as well as some of the expectations that he's kind of given some of these missionaries. They aren't fulfilled. So there's a lot of challenges between the groups. Later years of his life, there's the continued physical struggles. He has a variety of illnesses. There is the continued conflicts between Livingstone and other missionaries. Other challenges arise as well. He would die in 1873, but his life would continue to inspire more missionaries. So even though he is not maybe exemplary as a missionary individual compared to some of the other people we've talked about, he has a significant amount of influence in inspiring other people to take up this endeavor, to be involved in missions, to support missionaries, as well as specifically, of course, in Africa. China was another area that gets a lot of attention from Protestants in the 19th century. China has always been a difficult place to evangelize. In many respects, China has often been an isolationist country, even before it became communist in the late 1940s. It's never been open to outsiders in any significant way for a long period of time. There have been some times where certain leaders have been more open to outside influences and have been welcoming to people from the non-Chinese people from outside. And so Christians, especially Christian missionaries, have had difficult times at trying to get into China at various times. There have been kind of 4 stages of missionary work in China. We highlighted a few of these. The Nestorian missions, the Syrian church, the Church of the East. We talked about how in 700s to 800s make some inroads into China. There are some efforts there that do bring about some success, but eventually kind of fall away, persecution, etc. A second stage of work was through a man named Friar John, who we didn't talk about. He lived toward the end of the Middle Ages, late 1200s, early 1300s. He was a Franciscan monk, and he gained about 6,000 followers through his efforts in China. But persecution hindered that work, and it essentially kind of tapered off. The third stage we did talk about, the efforts of Francis Xavier and then Matteo Ricci in the 16th century, bringing Catholicism. 2 efforts, of course, Ricci somewhat more successful than Francis Xavier. That work would be somewhat more successful than the others, would continue even into the 19th century despite persecution. But there weren't a lot of missionaries that were going into China from Catholic sources. after some of the efforts by Ricci and Xavier. The fourth stage, of course, is the one we're talking about here, the efforts of Protestants in China in the 19th century. Now, one particular event we've touched on before that becomes very important for relationships between Chinese and outsiders in the 19th century was an encounter known as the Opium War. So, the British East India Company, operating in India, starts bringing opium, which today we consider to be a drug, starts bringing opium into China from India. Even then, it was very, very addictive and would ensnare people. And, you know, 3 of the sons of the Chinese emperor died from addiction to opium. However, it was a very, very profitable trade to bring this opium into China. And so the East India Company tried to present it as being no more dangerous than tobacco, which of course today we know a lot more about the dangers of tobacco than they did in the 19th century, but they presented it as, oh, it's not that bad. And so they are, you know, very active in funneling this opium into China. Well, the Chinese officials are very upset at this, and so they make a variety of efforts to try and halt the opium trade. They tried to ban any trade of opium. They sometimes removed foreign merchants from China because of this. Well, the British continue to bring opium in despite the Chinese trying to resist it. It eventually leads to open warfare, violence, military engagement, and the British win. Part of their spoils, so to speak, is the control of Hong Kong, and the British will actually have control of Hong Kong into the later 20th century before they return it back to the Chinese. And so the experience for people living in Hong Kong was different than the experience of a lot of other people living in China, because that region was under the control of Britain. Here too, like what we saw with slavery, with colonialism, there were some missionaries who were deeply involved in the opium trade. Other missionaries were very against some of those efforts, but most missionaries were supportive of the ideas of having the openness of Chinese borders to mission efforts, even if it happened because of the force of arms. So even though it happens because of this military conflict, they like the idea of being able to get into China. Again, right, 21st century, you might say, hey, the ends don't justify the means. But, you know, for a lot of people, this was something they were supportive of. Let's talk about a couple of missionaries Protestant missionaries involved in China. One of the first Protestant missionaries in China was a man named Robert Morrison. Morrison was born in England in 1782. He was the youngest of 8 children. And at a very early age, somewhere between 5 and 10, he's already talking about wanting to go into missions, wanting to do missionary work. Well, his mother is not particularly interested in him becoming a missionary, doesn't want him going abroad. And so as long as she is alive, Robert will submit to her wishes. And so even though once he starts getting into young adulthood, he will continue not to pursue his missionary desires because he knows how opposed his mother is to it. When she passes away, though, you know, he's still a young adult, so she passes away. He goes to London to get ministerial training. He's accepted by the London Missionary Society, and he wants to go to China. Well, as he begins to prepare, he learns Chinese. His interest is going to China, but the East India Company has made it very difficult for missionaries to get into China. They have prohibited evangelism in China. Again, that's like, wow, that seems such a foreign concept to us today, that it's from the same country. I think that here he is, a British citizen wanting to go evangelize the Chinese, and this British company is preventing him from doing so. Well, he continues to work anyway. He studies the language in secret. He knows that he's under scrutiny because eventually he will get to China. He will get there, and he's practically working by himself. And there was another missionary who was supposed to go with him, but he doesn't make it there. He kind of bails. So here's Morrison working in secrecy. He knows he's got a lot of scrutiny, but he's trying to prepare to evangelize. Well, he gets some language tutors. Eventually, he will create a dictionary as part of secretly translating the Bible. Well, the East India Company finds out about the dictionary, likes the dictionary, offers him a job, and they pay him pretty well. And so, he's actually kind of benefiting from some of his language work. During this time, he'll also get married, but they will actually have to live in separate regions of China because of some of the restrictions that existed. Well, his wife, has a lot of physical and emotional problems, and that puts a strain on their marriage because, Robert's gone for 6 months out of the year. And so she's having to kind of, live her own. They will eventually have some children. That adds to further stress. She will leave China for about 6 years, go back to England. So for 6 years, her and the children are in England. She will return after those 6 years and die shortly after that. Morrison will then send the children back to England because he wants to put so much of his effort into missionary work, especially Bible translation. Well, eventually the East India Company finds out about this secret translation he's been working on. And officials within the organization order him to be terminated. And you need to fire this guy. But he actually isn't fired. So he does, is able to continue to work. With his desire to create a Chinese translation, he's actually in kind of this rivalry with Joshua Marshman in Serampore. Was part of Carey's team because Marshman wants to produce a Chinese Bible translation. Well, so they're kind of competing to see who's going to be the first one to translate the Bible into Chinese. Marshman becomes the first. His translation, however, isn't as good as Morrison's. So Morrison will actually have, more long-lived translation. He will return to England in the 1820s, speak at a variety of places, recruiting people to serve as missionaries, trying to get them to be interested in missionary efforts of China especially. He will eventually go back to China, but is required to engage in negotiations between the English and the Chinese. Eventually, Morrison will die in China. He'd gotten married again, had a growing family. He dies in 1834. A lot of his effort, again, was on Bible translation. He doesn't really convert that many people. So most of the work that he does is more from the language standpoint than from numbers of people converted. Another prominent individual in Chinese missions was James Hudson Taylor, often just referred to as Hudson Taylor. He was born in England in 1832, so around the time Morrison is getting older, about ready to die, Hudson Taylor is born. His father was very encouraging of him to get into mission work, unlike Morrison's mother, who had resisted it. And at a very early age, Taylor becomes interested in China as a place to be active in. He decides that he wants to connect to the Chinese through the study of medicine. his focus is going to be mission work, but it's going to be more, trying to use medicine to kind of get connected with the Chinese. But he doesn't really get a very, very good education. Doesn't get a lot of it, unlike Livingston, who has a much broader background in medicine. He will eventually kind of get some more education in medicine and some other things. But when he kind of starts off, he doesn't have a lot of it. Well, as he's preparing for missionary work, he begins living a very simple lifestyle, trying to live a less of a lifestyle so that he'll be able to make it through the austere conditions of Chinese missionary work. When news reaches Britain of the Taiping Rebellion, which we talked about in Survey of Church History, essentially it's this rebellion that takes place in China that has some connections to Christianity. Hong Xiuquan is somebody that kind of combines some Confucian elements with some Christian elements, and it started this revolt. And so news reaches Britain of this revolt, and the Chinese Evangelization Society sends Taylor to China. He's 21, so he's still fairly young. But the idea is, okay, here's an opening that that's being provided that will open doors for missionary work. Well, by the time Taylor gets there, it becomes obvious that the Taiping Rebellion was not successful, and it had actually fallen apart. Sizable numbers of Chinese die in the rebellion, and so the opportunity that was available, or was at least supposedly available, turns not to be the case. So the Taiping Rebellion doesn't bear fruit. Additionally, when Taylor gets to China, he faces opposition from other missionaries, and not particularly welcoming to him. He feels like they're living in luxury, they're too self-indulgent, and they don't particularly care for him because they think he's not very well educated. So there's a lot of conflict between the missionaries over this. He has a lot of a struggle trying to learn Chinese, but he believes that not only is it important to learn the language, it's important to adopt Chinese culture, particularly dress, and that by dressing like other people in China, he will be more likely to make connections to the Chinese. This was not something that a lot of Protestant missionaries were doing. They were continuing to have their European styles. Now, the Jesuits, Xavier and Ricci and others, had done something similar, particularly Ricci, in adopting Chinese modes of dress. So it was something that the Catholics had done, but the Protestants had pretty well avoided it. Well, he, by dressing this way, he is obviously different, because here's this European dressing like a Chinese. So the Chinese aren't sure what to do with him. The other missionaries make fun of him. But he thinks that this is the way to connect with the Chinese. He will get married. He gets married to the daughter of missionaries in China. They will return to England in the 1860s with the idea that they're going to create a new work, which they call the China Inland Mission. Becomes important work in Chinese missions. It is to be an independent mission, and really meant to be a kind of faith mission. The Taylor is saying the missionaries are not going to have any salary. They're to rely on God. It was meant to appeal to the working class. Taylor doesn't have a lot of faith that the educated ministers in England are going to help the Chinese, so he's trying to connect with the lower classes, middle classes, to be interested in missions. And unlike other missionary societies, the China Inland Mission would be headquartered in China, as opposed to like London or Massachusetts, like the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions. The Taylors would return to China. They bring along 15 missionary recruits, new missionaries. 7 of them are single women. In the 19th century, missionary societies were more open to women and even single women being involved in missionary efforts. We'll talk more about that in a subsequent session. The missionaries that come with Chinese Inland Mission, the China Inland Mission, are encouraged to adopt the same types of things that Taylor adopted: Chinese dress, simple lifestyle, etc. This gets them ridicule from other missionaries. In the 1860s, the late 1860s, missionaries would be attacked. The mission house was set on fire, some property stolen, etc. The Royal Navy would get involved, and it becomes this public relations nightmare, and leads to a lot of the support from England drying up for the mission. Despite this, Taylor would continue to make trips to England to try and get more people to serve as missionaries, and he's able to do that despite the fact that there are hardships awaiting people if they go back with him. But there were people that continued to go back. In 1895, by 1895, there were 640 missionaries in China connected to China Inland Missions. So it does become successful, even though it faces a lot of challenges. One of those challenges occurs in June of 1900. The Chinese emperor decrees that all foreigners were to be killed and that Christianity was to be removed. 135 missionaries and 53 missionary children are killed in all of this. But the mission is able to continue its work even into the 20th century and escapes some elements of that and is still able to survive. So the 19th century becomes this really important century for particularly Protestant missionary efforts. A lot more that could be said, a lot more regions that we could talk about. But it really sets the stage for a greater interest, a global interest, as people are going all over the place. It's in Asia, it's in China, it's in Africa. There are other places that we'll look at. And then it also becomes a field where more women are getting involved, sometimes as single women, because there's more receptivity to this than there had been in previous generations. And some of those kind of things we'll highlight in later sessions.